Lady Eleanor de Thornbury awoke, as she had every night for 39 nights at the exact moment the chapel bell should have rung for matins, though no one had rung it in weeks. It was not a sound that woke her, but the certainty that something was waiting for her to wake. She lay motionless beneath the wool blankets, eyes open toward the dark beams of the ceiling, counting the beats of her own heart the way one counts the footsteps of an intruder. And then she heard them because they always came after the certainty. Slow footsteps, heavy ones, the footsteps of someone in no hurry, advancing down the north corridor toward her door. They stopped before it. Eleanor pressed the olive-wood rosary that slept tangled around her wrist and prayed without moving her lips, because she had learned that her voice, in those hours, did not entirely belong to her. When she gathered the courage to open the door, the corridor was empty, and the candles in the iron sconces stood extinguished, still smoking as if someone had just passed by, blowing them out one by one. She went down alone, a lamp trembling in her hand and her chestnut braid undone over her shoulder, and found Alice, the last young servant girl remaining at Ravenshold, kneeling beside the gate with her bundle packed and her face ruined by weeping. The girl did not rise when she saw her. On the contrary, she bowed her head lower, as if asking what she was about to ask were itself a kind of betrayal. "My lady, give me your blessing, and let me go home to my own people," she said in a broken voice. "Because I love you well. God knows I love you well. But someone walks in this house who eats no bread, and I do not have soul enough to share a roof with one who does not share the table." Eleanor felt the cold of the stone flags climb up through her bare feet, and understood that she had no right to keep her. She traced the cross on the girl's forehead, pressed into her hand 2 coins she could not spare, and opened the gate herself. Outside, in the courtyard turning blue with the coming dawn, the huntsman's dogs howled without approaching, staring fixedly at the same window, the window of the old chamber of Sir Geoffrey, her grandfather, dead now more than 20 years. It had all begun the night of the storm, 40 days earlier, and Eleanor remembered it with the clarity with which one remembers thresholds that can never be crossed back again. She was returning from carrying bread and linen to the sick of the village, when the sky collapsed over the oak woods, and through the roar of the water she heard something that was neither wind nor breaking branch, the crying of a child. She found him curled in the hollow of an ancient oak, soaked through, his lips gone violet, a little boy of about 7 who said his name was Tom, son of the charcoal burners of the valley, lost since midday. Eleanor wrapped him in her own cloak, and as she lifted him from the ground, her hand touched something hard and cold in the mud, a medallion of blackened bronze bearing the worn image of the Virgin and Child, and traces of a blue enamel that must once have been beautiful. She tucked it against her breast without thinking, the way one gathers up any holy thing found lying in the earth, and rode toward the castle with the child asleep against her heart, not knowing that she carried 2 things home that night, and that only one of them was innocent. She returned little Tom to his parents the next day, with a sack of grain and the promise to watch over him, and she laid the medallion on the chest in her chamber, meaning to give it to the chaplain at the first opportunity. Before we go on with this story, I would love to know from what corner of the world you are joining us today. Leave the name of your city or your town in the comments, because every story is heard differently depending on the place from which you live it. And from the place where Eleanor lived it, which was the solitude of a castle far too large for a widow of 32, the days that followed the storm began to bend and darken, with a slowness that at first no one knew how to name. The first night she woke at the hour of matins and blamed exhaustion. The second, she heard the footsteps and blamed the wind on the battlements. The 7th, when the 12 candles of the chapel went out all at once during her evening prayer, leaving the tabernacle in darkness and Eleanor on her knees in a silence that seemed to have weight. She understood that the wind does not blow inward through stone walls. Then the servants began to leave. The first was the stable boy, who swore he had seen the shadow of a man walking the upper gallery when everyone slept, a shadow that always stopped before the same door, the sealed door of Sir Geoffrey's old chamber. Then the cook, who found the iron trivets overturned every morning and the fire dead though she banked it carefully each night. Then the others, 2 by 2, 3 by 3, asking for their blessing and their wages with lowered eyes, until in the kitchens of the castle, where 20 people had once bustled, there remained only Marjorie, the housekeeper who had served the Thornburys since childhood, a woman of 50, broad of shoulder and broad of faith, who planted herself before Eleanor with the keys at her belt and said simply, "I saw you born, my lady, and I saw you bury your father and your husband in the same winter without your knees ever buckling. If this house has an evil in it, we will pass through it together because evils like winters are better passed through in company." It was the only time in all those weeks that Eleanor came close to weeping. The animals were more honest than the men, because they did not know how to pretend. The huntsman's dogs refused to pass through the gate even when dragged by the collar, and they howled at dusk, always staring toward the same window. The horses reared in the courtyard without visible cause, and the old falcon of her late husband, which had rested on its perch in the great hall for years, snapped its jesses one afternoon and hurled itself against the window glass until it broke through, preferring the freezing November sky to the warmth of the hearth. The hens stopped laying. The kitchen cats disappeared, and Eleanor, who recorded every detail in her memory with the stubborn serenity of a woman refusing to go mad, observed one thing she told no one. All the animals, each in its own way, avoided the north wing, the wing of the corridor where the footsteps sounded, the wing of the sealed chamber where her grandfather Sir Geoffrey had spent his final years receiving no one, refusing even, according to what the old folk whispered, to let the chaplain bring him Holy Communion. They brought Master Nicholas from York, a physician of 60 with fingers stained by ink and ointments, who examined her for 2 full days, looked at her tongue and her eyes, questioned her about her dreams and her dead, and pronounced, with the solemnity of a man who charges dearly, that all of it was an excess of black bile, the melancholy of widowhood aggravated by isolation and the mists of the moors. He prescribed bloodletting, hen broth, watered wine with honey, and above all rest, far if possible from that damp castle. "The footsteps her ladyship hears," he explained before Marjorie, wiping his lenses with his sleeve, "are produced by her own blood beating in her ears, and the candles go out because the drafts in these old walls are treacherous. I have seen a dozen identical cases, all of them in women living alone." Eleanor endured the bloodletting with clenched teeth and an outstretched arm, and every night, weaker and paler, she went on waking at the exact hour of matins, listening to footsteps that her blood, however hard it beat, could not possibly be taking in the corridor. Father Edmund, the chaplain of the castle, was a man of 45, learned, a man of libraries and Latin, who loved God with his head more than with his knees. He blessed the walls, sprinkled holy water down the corridors, celebrated a mass for the souls of the household's dead, and then, in the sacristy, took Eleanor's hands between his own, with a sincere affection that made his words all the more painful. "My lady, the devil exists, but he is lazier than people believe. He rarely labors where grief and loneliness already labor for him. Your ladyship has lost a father and a husband in a single winter, governs alone lands that would weigh on any man, and barely sleeps. Do not search the air for what dwells in an afflicted heart. Pray, eat, sleep, and let time do its work." Eleanor listened with a serene gaze and a straight back, and as she left the sacristy she understood, with a new kind of cold, that she was completely alone. Neither science nor the Church of Reasonable Men was going to believe her. It was then that Sir Roger arrived. Her uncle presented himself one rainy afternoon with 6 men in escort, and that solemnity of his, all dark cloth and marten fur, still tall at 58, his gray beard trimmed with precision, and the signet ring of the Thornburys gleaming on the large hand with which he took both of his nieces. "I have heard what is happening in this house," he said in a grave voice that filled the hall the way bells fill an empty church, "and I have come because blood hastens to where blood suffers." At supper he showed himself attentive, fatherly, almost tender. He asked about the fled servants, the physician's verdicts, the sleepless nights, and he listened to every answer, nodding slowly, his small dark eyes fixed on his niece in a way that Eleanor, exhausted as she was, took too long to recognize. It was not the gaze of a man discovering a problem, but of a man confirming how much a problem he already knew about had grown. The only instant in which that marble mask cracked was brief as the blink of an eye, but Eleanor kept it without yet knowing why. It happened when Marjorie, pouring the wine, remarked that all the troubles had begun the night of the storm, when the lady had saved the charcoal burner's son and brought home from the woods that ancient medallion. Sir Roger stopped his cup halfway to his lips. "What medallion?" he asked, and though the voice remained the same as ever, the knuckles of the hand that bore the ring went white against the silver. Eleanor had it brought. Her uncle took it, held it toward the candelabrum, and for the space of 3 heartbeats, the Lord of the Thornbury Tower, the man who boasted he had never trembled before Scots or kings, looked at that blackened bronze with its worn virgin the way one looks into an open grave. Then he set it down on the table, well away from himself, and said with a calm that was too perfect, "Peasant trinket, in your place I would throw it down the well, for old objects carry old humors." And he changed the subject with the elegance of a man closing a door without a sound. A week later, Eleanor understood what her uncle had truly come for. Sir Roger summoned the kinsmen of the house to the great hall, 2 cousins of her father, a brother-in-law of her late husband, the archpriest of the shire. He received them himself, as though the castle were his, beneath the banners embroidered with the Thornbury arms, and he spoke at length of the sorrow it caused him to say what he was about to say. He spoke of the fled servants, the bloodlettings, the estate's accounts left ungoverned of a young lady alone, childless, who claimed to hear the footsteps of the dead. "No one loves my niece more than I do," he concluded, laying the hand that bore the ring upon Eleanor's shoulder with a weight that was anything but affection. "And for that love I propose what I propose, that the governance of these lands rest with me temporarily, as a burden rests on more accustomed shoulders, while she recovers her health in some convent of peace, not as punishment but as remedy." And the kinsman nodded slowly, looking at Eleanor with that pity which humiliates more deeply than contempt, because no one can defend herself against pity without seeming to be precisely what they say she is. Eleanor rose to her feet without a tremor in her voice, though everything else in her trembled. "I thank my lord uncle for his concern," she said, holding the eyes of those men one by one. "But my father taught me that the Thornburys do not surrender what God gave them to keep, neither their lands nor their wits. I am sick with sleeplessness, not with madness, and as long as I can tell a parchment from a lie, this estate has a lady." There was an uncomfortable silence, the kind in which men study their wine so as not to study one another, and Sir Roger smiled with an admirably constructed sadness, as if telling the others without words, "See how she clings. This is how it always begins." That night, alone in the freezing chapel, Eleanor knelt before the tabernacle, and for the first time in 40 nights she did not ask for sleep. She asked for light. "Lord, if this comes from you, give me strength. If it comes from the enemy, give me weapons. But if it comes from this house..." And as she spoke the words, she felt herself touch, without meaning to, the very edge of the truth. "Give me the courage to look at what no one has been willing to look at." It was Marjorie who, without knowing it, showed her the road. Eleanor found her in the kitchens before dawn, coaxing the dead fire back to life for the 100th time, and the housekeeper, in the low voice of one unearthing forbidden things, confessed that all of this reminded her of the tales the old women used to tell in her childhood, when she was a scullery girl in those same kitchens. "They said, my lady, that Sir Geoffrey, your grandfather, God rest him, did not sleep. That in his last years he ordered the window of his chamber that looked toward the south road walled shut, and that once, drunk on the mass wine, he shouted at his servants to take every image of Our Lady in this castle out of his sight. And they said one thing more, lower still, that I never understood, that all the gold of the Thornburys smelled of the smoke of the burned church of Calderwell." Eleanor felt that name, which she had never once heard, fit into her chest the way an ancient key fits into a lock everyone has forgotten. With resistance at first, and then with a click that can never be undone. The next day, without asking anyone's leave and without informing her uncle, Eleanor had 2 mules saddled, took the medallion, wrapped bread and cheese in a cloth, and set out with Marjorie for the convent of Kirkstall, half a day's ride away, where Mother Winifred had governed for 40 years. The aged abbess who had known her grandmother and had heard, it was said, the confessions of half the dying North in the time of the wars. They rode beneath a leaden sky, between frost-whitened stubble fields, and Eleanor noticed something that raised the hair on her arms more than the cold. The farther she traveled from the castle, the lighter the air became in her lungs, as though she had been breathing underwater for weeks without knowing it. They were received at nightfall in the convent parlor, a bare room with a crucifix, a brazier, and 2 rush-bottomed chairs, and into it came, leaning on her ash-wood staff, small and stooped, with eyes of a blue so pale they seemed made of winter, the only person in all the north of England who was not going to tell her she was mad. Mother Winifred listened without interrupting her even once, her age-twisted hands crossed in her lap, while Eleanor told everything, the storm, the child, the nights, the footsteps, the candles, the animals, the physician, the chaplain, her uncle. When she finished, the old woman remained silent a long while and then said only, "Show me what you brought home from the woods, my daughter." Eleanor placed the medallion in those small, crooked hands, and what happened then she would not forget as long as she lived. The abbess turned it toward the light of the brazier, ran the pad of her thumb across the half-erased inscription on the reverse, and all the blood fled from her wrinkled face the way water flees from a wrung cloth. Her lips moved as she read the worn Latin, and when she raised her eyes, those winter eyes were full of something Eleanor had not expected to find in a holy woman, an old fear, and beneath the fear, a certainty. "My daughter," she asked in a threat of a voice, "where was your Lord Grandfather, Sir Geoffrey de Thornbury, in the winter of the War of Caldwell?" Eleanor did not know how to answer, and her ignorance seemed to grieve the old woman more than any answer could have. Mother Winifred rose, leaning on her staff, sent for the sister archivist, and led Eleanor down a freezing corridor to the archive room, where the chest of chronicles was opened with 3 separate keys amid the smell of dust, leather, and centuries. They searched by the light of a single candle, folio after folio, until the abbess's crooked finger stopped upon a page written by a monk dead for decades, in that cramped hand of a man setting down things he would rather not know. And Eleanor read. She read how, in that winter of the wars, knights in the service of a great lord of the north entered the village of Caldwell, how they plundered its church and tore from the altar the consecrated image of Our Lady, a bronze medallion with blue enamel that the villagers had venerated since the days of the Crusades, how they set fire to the church with the parish priest inside, and how the priest, from within the flames, cried out to God that the house of that knight would know neither rest nor sleep until what was stolen was restored and the sacrilege repaired. The monk had not written the knight's name, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of charity, but in the margin of the folio, in paler ink, he had drawn a coat of arms so that memory would not be entirely lost. And Eleanor, with the medallion burning in her hand like a cold ember, recognized in that small drawing, stroke by stroke, quarter by quarter, the same coat of arms that presided over the great hall of her own castle, embroidered on the banners beneath which her uncle had just asked for her estate. Eleanor would never afterward be able to say how long she stood motionless before that folio, the medallion clenched in her fist, and the coat of arms of her own blood staring back at her from the margin, like an accusation that had waited decades to be read. It was Mother Winifred's voice that returned her to the world, a low, steady voice offering not consolation, but something better, truth. Now you understand, my daughter, what I began to suspect when they told me of a countess who woke every night at the hour of matins. The medallion did not bring the evil into your house. The evil had lived in your house since before you were born, seated at the table, embroidered on the banners, sleeping beneath the flagstones of the chapel. What that bronze did was wake it, because God, who is patient but never forgetful, permitted a work of charity to place in your hands the only key capable of opening that door. A child lost in a storm, my daughter. That is how Providence works. Through what is small, through what is weak, through what no one is watching. Eleanor wanted to ask why she, who had burned no church, should carry that debt, and the old woman seemed to read the thought on her face because she answered before Eleanor could speak. Because you inherited the lands that fire paid for. No one inherits the wheat without inheriting the ground where it grew, even when the ground hides bones. She returned to the castle 2 days later with a purpose that straightened her spine and terrified her soul in equal measure. Reparation. The abbess had told her plainly, with that sweet bluntness of those who no longer fear anything in this world. The restitution must be complete and public, or it would be nothing. Return the medallion to Caldwell, rebuild the desecrated altar with the estate's revenues, endow perpetual masses for the soul of the murdered priest, and ask forgiveness aloud and in the name of her blood, before God and before the descendants of those villagers. But first, she needed something more. She needed to know, and in the castle's archive, where she spent 3 whole nights among parchments that smelled of old wax, Eleanor found the first confirmation for herself. In the account books of the year of the wars, written in her grandfather's forceful hand, appeared the entries of a considerable plunder, wrought silver, chalices, and altar frontal, all recorded under a euphemism that now froze her blood. Goods recovered from the enemies of our cause. And in the will of Sir Geoffrey, which Eleanor had read as a girl without understanding it, a strange clause suddenly took on a terrible meaning. The command that no mass for the dead ever be sung for his soul in the chapel of the castle, but only elsewhere far away, as if the dead man himself had known that those walls were not consecrated ground for him. Eleanor's solution begot, as nearly all brave solutions do, a larger problem. She needed the estate's revenues for the rebuilding, and the revenues passed through the hands of Sir Roger, who had administered the rents of half the villages for years. When she wrote to him requesting the accounts and the release of funds for a pious work she did not specify, her uncle's answer came not on parchment, but in person, 3 days later, with more men than the last time and without the mask of tenderness. He found her in the archive, surrounded by the open books of the war years, and Eleanor saw in his small dark eyes the exact instant in which Sir Roger understood what his niece had understood. "Close those books," he said, in a voice that no longer filled the hall like a bell but cut like the winds of January. "There are doors, niece, that the living do not open without the dead collecting their toll." Eleanor straightened, her hand upon the folio, and answered without raising her voice. "The dead have been collecting their toll from me for 40 nights, uncle, for a door I did not even know existed. You tell me then, you who were his squire in that war, what happened at Caldwell?" And for the second time in her life, Eleanor saw the marble crack. Sir Roger went pale, not with surprise, but with something far older, and instead of answering, he did something worse. He walked out of the archive, gathered his men in the courtyard, and that same afternoon rode for York, where the archdeacon resided, to arrive there before the truth did. And here it is worth pausing a moment, because this story is not only about Eleanor, nor only about a castle on the moors, nor only about a medallion of blackened bronze. It is about all those families who built their comfort upon something no one wants to name, and about all those people who discover one day that the peace of their house is mortgaged to guilts that others contracted and no one ever paid. It is about those who keep silent for decades, believing that silence protects, when silence only buries, and what is buried without reparation does not die. It waits. And it is about, above all, that difficult hour in which God places before a good person a debt that is not hers, and asks her, without words, whether she has the humility to pay it. If you have ever felt that you were carrying the consequences of someone else's sins, if you have ever had to ask forgiveness for something you did not do, so that your family could finally sleep in peace, stay with this story, because what Eleanor was about to learn is that there are battles that are not won with swords or with parchments, but on one's knees, and that those are precisely the battles that change the destiny of an entire bloodline. Sir Roger's blow arrived wrapped in incense. A week later, a messenger from the archdeacon summoned the Countess of Ravenshold to appear at York, where her lord uncle had presented, with the tears of a grieving kinsman, a petition for an examination of his niece's wits. Afflicted, the writ said, by nocturnal visions, by traffic with peasant superstitions, and by the delusional purpose of squandering the estate's revenues on rebuilding a ruined church in another lord's domain, dishonoring in the process the memory of the most illustrious of the Thornburys. It was a masterstroke, and Eleanor recognized it as such with a coldness that astonished even her. If she defended her project, she confirmed the delusion. If she abandoned it, the curse would go on devouring her house night after night until it drove her truly mad, and then the wardship would fall on its own, the way rotten fruit falls. It was Marjorie who found her that night sitting in the dark chapel, the medallion in her hands, so still she seemed another statue. And it was Marjorie who heard from her lips the closest thing to a surrender Eleanor ever spoke. Perhaps they are all right, and this is my pride. Perhaps I should enter a convent and hand over the keys and let God collect from another generation what mine did not know how to pay him. The housekeeper was silent a moment, and then said something no theology could have said better. My lady, if this were pride, you would want to be right, and you do not want to be right. You want your house to rest. That is not pride. That is love with a tired face. Dawn brought, as it so often does in the designs of Providence, help by the humblest road. Before the castle gate, where the animals still refused to enter, waited little Tom, the charcoal burner's son, his feet wrapped in rags and a message learned by heart. The mother abbess had sent word to his family, and his father had something the lady countess needed to hear. In the charcoal camp of the valley, amid oak smoke and blackened walls, the charcoal burner, a stooped man with cracked hands, told her what his own grandfather had passed to him on his deathbed, that the charcoal burners of that forest were descended from the fugitives of Calderwell, the few who escaped the night of the fire, that the old lord Sir Geoffrey, years after the war, would sometimes ride alone to the edge of the woods and sit staring at the trees without entering, like a man circling a grave, and that one winter dawn, shortly before he died, they saw him hurl something in among the oaks from horseback, something small that flashed an instant in the air, and no charcoal burner ever went looking for it, because the things that lords throw away in the night weigh more than gold. Our old people used to say, my lady, that Our Lady of Calderwell would return to her altar on the day she was lifted from the mud by a hand clean of that blood and dirty with charity. We never understood what it meant, until you pulled my son out of the storm. With the charcoal burner's testimony, the convent's chronicle, and the account books of her own archive, Eleanor finally had weapons, but every weapon carried its price, and the price of these was devastating. To use them meant proclaiming before the church, and before half the north of England, that the hero of the Thornburys, the grandfather whose name opened doors from York to Durham, had been a desecrator and a killer of priests. It meant staining the name of her own father, who had lived and died honoring that memory without ever knowing it. Mother Winifred, when Eleanor brought that anguish to the convent parlor, did not soften it for her. Yes, my daughter, that is what it means. Truth does not repair without first breaking, just as the surgeon does not heal without first cutting. The question you must answer before the tabernacle is not whether your grandfather deserves the shame, but whether the priest of Calderwell deserves justice, and whether your house deserves peace. Choose your dead, Eleanor de Thornbury. All of us, sooner or later, choose our dead. And Eleanor chose. She wrote to the archdeacon accepting the summons, but not at York, rather at the ruins of Calderwell on the second Sunday of Advent, where she would present before God and men the proofs of what she intended to do and why. It was an audacity bordering on insolence, and precisely for that reason the archdeacon, a curious old man who had suspected from the beginning that this quarrel smelled of things far deeper than a widow's black bile, accepted. The second Sunday of Advent dawned with a frost that turned the world white, and Calderwell, which for decades had been nothing but a whispered name, filled with people as it had not filled since before the fire. The charcoal burners of the forest came with their families, descendants of the fugitives dressed in their humble holy-day clothes. Mother Winifred came in a convent cart, escorted by 2 nuns and her ashwood staff. The archdeacon came with his notaries, And there came, summoned by the very suit Sir Roger had set in motion, the kinsmen of the house, the same men who months before had nodded with pity in the Hall of the Banners. And Sir Roger came last, with 12 armed men, and the face of a man riding not to a hearing but to a battle, determined to prevent, he declared aloud as he dismounted, a sick woman from consummating before the church the dishonor of a house worth more than all the burned villages in England. The ruins listened, stumps of blackened walls rising through the frost, the empty socket of the altar like an eye torn from its face, and over everything a silence that was not the absence of sound, but the presence of memory. Eleanor spoke standing upon the broken stones without raising her voice, because she had learned in 40 nights of sleeplessness that great truths do not need to be shouted. She had the notary read the convent's chronicle, folio, and coat of arms. She had him read the entries of the account book in Sir Geoffrey's own hand. She had the charcoal burner speak, and he told of the midnight rider and of the flash of metal falling among the oaks, with the solemn clumsiness of men who do not know how to lie. And then she raised the medallion for all to see, the blackened bronze, the blue enamel, the virgin worn smooth by generations of village hands, and said, "I do not come to judge my grandfather, for he stands already before a better judge. I come to return what my house stole, to rebuild what my house burned, and to ask forgiveness for the blood my house spilled in this holy place. And if doing this is madness, as my lord uncle claims, then I pray God never restore me to sanity." It was in that moment that Sir Roger pushed forward through the crowd with his hand on his sword hilt, shouting that it was all false, that the chronicle was the scribbling of resentful monks, that the arms in the margin could belong to 20 houses, and the archdeacon, with the dangerous calm of old men who have seen everything, put to him a single question. "Sir Roger de Thornbury, you served your father as squire in that war. Upon these consecrated stones and before these witnesses, do you swear upon your soul that your house did not do what that chronicle records?" The silence that followed was the longest Eleanor ever knew. Sir Roger opened his mouth to swear, and everyone saw it, and everyone saw as well that the oath would not come out. He looked at the blackened stones. He looked at the empty socket of the altar. He looked at the medallion in his niece's hands, and something that had held itself upright inside that tall, solemn man for 50 years gave way all at once, the way old walls give way, first without a sound and then with a roar. "I was 14 years old," he said, and the voice that had filled great halls was now barely a hoarse thread. "I held the horses. I saw my father tear that image from the altar with his own hands. I saw the fire. I heard the priest from inside, and what he cried out was not pain. It was a prayer, the most terrible prayer I have heard in all my life, asking God for exactly what God has done." His knees buckled onto the frost, before the kinsmen, the notaries, the villagers whose grandparents had fled that fire, and he confessed what remained, that his father never again slept a full night, that he himself, from that dawn onward, had woken every night at the hour of matins, every night for 50 years, and had called it sleeplessness and had hidden it the way one hides a wound gone bad, and that when he learned his niece had carried the medallion home from the woods, he felt such terror that everything would come into the light that he chose to call her mad rather than call himself a witness. "Forgive me," he said at last, and he did not say it to Eleanor, but to the empty socket of the altar. "Forgive me, for I was a boy and kept silent. And then I was a man and went on keeping silent. And the silence has eaten my whole life. What happened next, none of those present ever forgot, though each told it afterward in his own way. Mother Winifred came forward, leaning on her staff, took the medallion from Eleanor's hands, and asked the archdeacon to bless the fallen stone that 2 charcoal burners had already raised over the empty place of the altar. And there, upon that poor and makeshift altar, the image of Our Lady of Calderwell returned to her home after half a century, set in place by Eleanor's hands, those hands clean of that blood and dirty with charity, while the archdeacon intoned the Miserere and the descendants of the fugitives wept without sound, the way people of the land weep, and the kinsmen of the Thornburys, the same men of the pity, now bowed their heads with a deeper and more just shame. The archdeacon dictated his ruling on the spot. Every petition of wardship over the Countess of Ravenshold was dismissed. Her wits declared not merely sound but exemplary. The rebuilding of the church from the estate's revenues was approved, along with the founding of a perpetual chantry for the soul of the martyred priest. And upon Sir Roger de Thornbury was imposed public penance and retirement to his tower house, removed from the governance of any land not his own, until his confessor should judge him reconciled. There were no chains and no gallows, and none were needed, for a man who had lived on nothing but respect, to leave Calderwell stripped of it, old, on his knees, and mourned by no one, was a sentence no executioner could have carried out better, though the abbess, watching him ride away, murmured something Eleanor kept the way one keeps seeds. Do not despise him entirely. He confessed at 70 what he hid at 14. I have known souls saved with less. That night, Eleanor did not sleep in the castle, but in the shelter the charcoal burners raised beside the ruins, on a straw pallet under a borrowed blanket, with little Tom asleep near the fire and Marjorie snoring her loyalty in the corner. And she slept. She slept the whole night through without footsteps, without silent bells, without that waking at matins that for 40 nights had torn her from sleep like a cold hand. And when she opened her eyes, the December sun was slipping through the cracks and someone outside was singing an old song of the fields, while the mules, for the first time in months, ate in peace. The rebuilding of Calderwell took 3 years, and Eleanor watched it stone by stone. Ravenshold filled again with servants, with dogs that trotted through the gate without fear, and hens that laid, and in the family chapel there was celebrated at last, for the first time, a mass for the soul of Sir Geoffrey de Thornbury, because the abbess taught Eleanor that a reparation which does not reach even the guilty stops halfway to God. The medallion remains to this day, the chronicles say, upon the altar of Calderwell, and the women of the shire touch it as they pass and tell their grandchildren the story of the countess who never slept, and of how, on a night of storm, by bending down to save a child who was not hers, a woman ended up saving all of her dead. Because there are debts that travel through the blood in silence, and there is only one coin that pays them: the humility of one who kneels for sins she did not commit, trusting that Providence never lays down a burden without first having laid down, somewhere along the road, the strength to carry it. If you believe that the truth, even after half a century, always finds its way back to its altar, write truth in the comments. And if this story reminded you of someone who carried the guilt of others so that their family could live in peace, write their name, if only so that someone else may read it with the respect it deserves.